Hey, what's up, everybody? I hope that you're doing well. I heard about the power outage in Merced. So if that affected you, I'm so sorry. Although you're here now, so something must have worked out for you. Maybe you weren't affected, but I just was thinking about how I used to live in Riverside and like we would have these fires and they would just turn the power grid off because it was such a risk. And that was really crappy, you just kind of got used to it. But I'm sharing the slides because so many students have asked. And, you know, it's one of those things where I want to help you to do your best in the class. And so I'm happy to do this. Just go to the chat here in Zoom and you'll find that I shared the slides for today. Now, keep in mind, though, that we might not get through all of them, but if you're a student who wants to take notes down below while I speak and comment, feel free to do that. I'm aware that I say a lot that's not on the slides. Let's go ahead and get started. We are discussing democracy, and that, after all, is what this course is about. And so far, we've only discussed political institutions, and maybe you've been wondering, when does democracy enter the picture? Well, there are two answers to that question. It enters now, but really democracy entered the picture during the Age of Revolution in the 18th century. And consistent with the class, we'll be introducing democracy by taking you through sort of like a genealogy or this sort of institutional analysis about the origin and the circumstances surrounding the birth of this system of government that is so absolutely pervasive in the world. Even today, as it's in decline, democracy remains really the buzzword because of the decline of democracy, not because of the return of dictatorship. So, what is it, and what do we mean, and how can we conceptualize it, and where did it come from? Today, we really think about elections above all as being the democratic institution, the race to choose public officials who will make decisions on behalf of everyone, the incorporation of citizens in an institutional process that has rules and regularities, and the extension of the vote to all sorts of groups who previously were not part of the process. Most notoriously women, but of course in the United States, also so blacks and other minorities. And still today, convicts and people in prison and jail can't always vote. In most states, they can't vote in the United States. Now, this picture is a picture of an election day proceeding in an African country. But the race to elect a public official or a leader that we call an election is just as important in African countries and African democracies. Elections are so important that we think of elections as synonymous with democracy. And sometimes we mistakenly call dictatorships democracies because they have elections, when in fact those are usually rigged or uncompetitive elections. Elections, above all, define democracy. But it wasn't always this way. And actually, concern about the relative merits of different institutions and different types of political systems goes back as far as Plato. And Plato not only didn't associate elections with democracy, but he also had contempt for democracy. And at that time, even though democracy had sort of worked in Athens, it wasn't thought of as a feasible way of governing a polity. It was viewed with contempt because the common people were associated with demos. Demos meant common people. And these commoners, who were part of democracy as it was understood, didn't have economic independence, they didn't have education, they didn't have knowledge of politics, they were uninformed, they were brutes, they were too unsophisticated to make decisions that would affect everyone, much less themselves. And even worse, they were expected to pursue their own interests at the expense of the community. And really that meant at the expense of rich people. Plato said that these poor people were likely to use their power against the interests of the rich people and against the interests of the rich, and therefore against the interests of the community. Aristotle had a much more charitable view. He said that sometimes the will of the many can be equal to or greater than the will of the few, however noble the few may be. And in fact, Aristotle had a typology of distinctions between types of regimes based upon the number of rulers and whether or not they behaved with virtue or they behaved corruptly. And so there was, of course, monarchy, which took the form of one ruler who ruled virtuously on behalf of all. But of course, the corruption of the monarch would result in tyranny. There was the aristocracy, which was the virtuous form of a few rulers, but those few rulers could just as easily become corrupt. And in that case, the system would be closer to something like an oligarchy. Now, this is where it becomes relevant for us. Aristotle said that if there are many rulers and they behave virtuously, the system is a polity. But if they behave corruptly, it becomes what he called a democracy. And there you have it. Even Aristotle, who was willing to acknowledge or entertain the idea that many could behave virtuously, still associated the idea of democracy with corruption and banality and evil. And this is really the striking feature of that discussion. It wasn't associated with elections and it wasn't associated with representatives. It was really viewed as a sort of perversion of the process. Democracy as we know it today really only entered the discourse at the end of the 18th century, and that was the age of revolution. This was the period when masses were rising up against monarchs and the nobility to challenge concentrations of power and demand the dispersion of authority and demand the creation of democratic and republican institutions, or ones that would capture the idea of collective self-rule. And it was in the age of revolution, or that period, the 18th century, when democracy versus aristocracy, or democracy versus autocracy replaced that earlier distinction between the one, the few, and the many. And so, really, only about 250 years ago, technically, did democracy become sort of the catchword or even part of the discussion at all. And it was at that point when we began to distinguish between democracy and authoritarianism. And aristocracy, that middle ground, fell by the wayside, and our focus turned to distinguishing between self-rule by the many, and sort of one person or group or one party rule by an authoritarian group or an authoritarian leader. And this is where we get to the present, where we distinguish between democracy and authoritarianism based upon this general concept of the number of rulers or the number of decision makers, or however many people are involved in the institutional process of decision making. But of course, we also associate both elections and representatives with democracy as we know it today. And so democracy as we conceive of it today is different in a variety of ways from how it was thought of before. And democracy as we conceive of it today is something that owes a great deal to the institutional foundations of the system and of the type of system that we're talking about when we say democracy. But before we get to those institutions and those precise foundations, we're going to deal more with democracy as a concept, and we're going to kind of unfold it and conceptualize it and talk about its components and its moving parts. Eventually, on Friday, we'll open that up to those institutional foundations that are implied by this concept of democracy that comes out of the age of revolution and that is still with us today. Now, before we continue, Let me take a look at the chat because I think we have a few comments. Hey, Hector, the slide should be available at the top of the chat. So I sent it to everyone. It should still be there. If it's not, let me know. Otherwise, maybe someone can share it with you, but it should be there. Jeffrey asks, is it aristocracy or autocracy? So aristocracy is thought of as rule by a few leaders. Autocracy is viewed as rule by one or a very small group. So aristocracy isn't really part of the discussion anymore. We actually distinguish between democracy and authoritarianism. And so that was the change that took place, one of the changes that took place in our understanding of the concept during the Age of Revolution. So we're going to watch a video that puts this in perspective, and in historical perspective in particular, just because I want to show you that democracy itself can be thought of as an institution or as an idea, as a practice, a convention that isn't automatic and isn't perennial, and really is itself a product of circumstances and historical processes that culminated in a period of sort of popular collective uprisings that we associate with the Age of Revolution. This is when democracy as we know it really entered the picture. So our institutional analysis begins with this institutional analysis of democracy itself and putting it in historical perspective. So we'll watch this and then we'll reconvene here in a moment.
This is the idea that took over the world.
First, there was one democracy,
then 10, then 20.
There were some setbacks.
But people really seemed to want democracy.
Eventually, most of them got one. But 15 years ago, democracy stopped spreading, and it might not pick back up again.
Even some places that seemed safely democratic turned out not to be. And people are even getting worried about established democracies like the US.
So, is there something wrong with democracy? I'm Max Fisher.
I'm Amanda Tao.
We're journalists at the New York Times.
And this is The Interpreter.
We can measure democracy, kind of like a health score. Over here, there are full democracies, like the United States.
And over there are dictatorships, like North Korea.
So the further left a country is, the less democratic it is. And the further right a country, the more democratic it is.
Now let's see what happens when we add how rich the countries are.
The higher on the graph, the richer the country, and the lower on the graph, the poorer the country. Generally, countries have moved up and right. As they got richer, they became more democratic.
You got your Englands, your Latvias, your Indonesias.
You see a pattern? Countries getting richer.
Countries getting more democratic. But
look at countries like China and Saudi Arabia. They got richer, but never got more democratic.
Look at Russia and Venezuela.
They got democratic, but then backslid, which wasn't supposed to happen. So what's going on?
China looked exactly like places we thought would become democracies next.
They built up the rule of law, civil society, and some institutions. Normally, those are the building blocks that eventually add up to democracy.
But they were really designed to make citizens just happy enough to protect the authoritarian system from the will of the people. And whenever the government feels like it could lose control,
it uses the other side of its strategy, violent oppression and coercion. We are seeing this in more places where dictators are learning how to stop democracy from forming.
And at the same time, some elected leaders are developing their own playbook for pulling democratic systems down from within. A handful of seemingly established democracies are sliding back towards dictatorship. These countries didn't have coups or invasions. In each case, voters elected strongman leaders who dismantled their democracies from within. Venezuela had been democratic for 40 years. Then Hugo Chavez rose on a message that only he spoke for the people. People cheered as he accrued power for himself, jailed his opponents, and tore down the democratic institutions that constrained him.
When the dust settled, Chavez was unchecked. Society descended into chaos that is getting worse every day. Other elected leaders are using similar tactics, but always bit by bit.
In ways that aren't obvious and might even be popular at the time.
One of the most powerful forces that can turn people against democracy is polarization. When people feel scared enough of their political opponents, it feels more important to protect their side than it does to protect democracy.
Leaders can exploit that fear. So if you're Russian and you support Putin, you might blame society's problems on gay people or nefarious Western plots.
If you're Turkish and support Erdogan, you fear the secular elites will impose military rule.
And we're seeing that kind of polarization and fear start to take hold in established democracies.
You are a racist, no good American. You don't care.
Could it happen in the United States? It still feels impossible.
And it might be. So far, the system is resilient. But the warning signs are here.
Polarization,
Populism,
distrust of institutions.
a desire for strongmen leaders to smash the system.
These things don't necessarily mean that democracy is doomed, but they show that in times of social stress, even a free people can dismantle their own democracy without realizing they're doing it.
Democracy is still a pretty new system of government. That century-long trend might not have been a trend at all.
Just a few one-time moments that we mistook for inevitability. We want to believe it will last forever,
But we can't be sure.
So when we put democracy in historical perspective, we see that democracy itself is really a product of a critical juncture that we would call the Age of Revolution, that period when traditional royalty monarchies were weakened because of certain types of changes. And as a result, it created an opportunity for societies and for popular movements to oppose regimes and demand democratic institutions in places like England, eventually the United States, France. In all of these cases, democracy became an alternative to the continuation of authoritarian rule in the form of traditional monarchy. So democracy itself is an institutional innovation that comes from a specific period of time. And when we think about democracy in historical perspective, that draws our attention moreover to the way that it has evolved. There have been fits and starts. There have been periods when democracy has gone into decline as well as surged forward. And the present period is one where it appears to be in decline. Now, with this in mind, it obviously begs the question, well, what is democracy then? And what are those institutional foundations that are so essential that were discussed in the video and that are clearly so relevant? Well, that's where we go next. And the question for us is how can we conceive of democracy in a way that is useful and concise and sets us up to assess and evaluate the institutions that promote and uphold democracy in those situations where it does maintain itself across time. And this is where we go now, conceptualizing and conceiving of democracy as a system of certain parts and certain components. I'm going to just check the chat really quick because there's a lot of comment here. Okay. So the question then is, how can we conceive of democracy? And really, we conceive of democracy in two different ways. We have two conceptual views of democracy that predominate. They're very different, and we will use both of them in this class to kind of paint a picture of the different components of democracy and then the institutions that undergird those different parts of that picture. So the first view is a procedural or minimalist view. This is a view of democracy that says that a democracy is a democracy because of the institutions or procedures it has in place, the processes that characterize that political system. Does it have institutions and procedures that are democratic, are formally democratic? If it does, it's a democracy. Now, what are those institutions or procedures? We'll discuss those in a moment. But a procedural view stands in contrast to a substantive view, which defines democracy by both its rules and the outcomes that it produces. This is going to be a very different view because not only are processes and institutions important, but the actual outcomes and the products of the regime are also relevant. And we then assess a whole set of different characteristics in conditions and outcomes and products. A procedural definition focuses squarely on institutions, norms, and processes. So the classical procedural definition comes from Joseph Schumpeter, who said, "A democracy is an arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote." Now notice, that's a very bare, minimal definition. There's not much there. The essence of that is to say that, look, it's a process, right? It's basically a race between elites to win the people's vote. It's a race between elites, and the winner of the race is inaugurated, and there you have it. You've got your democracy. Very, very minimal, very procedural. The focus is on the election, the contenders in the election, the outcome, and that's it. In fact, you can't even really say that the outcome is featured here in the definition at all. It basically just means that there's a race between elites to win the people's vote, and that is a competitive struggle. It is a relationship of competition where the outcome of the election is unknown, and we don't know beforehand who will take office or who will be declared the winner. It's a competitive race between elites to win the people's vote. Now, substantive definitions, they do include this emphasis on elections, but they also expect certain things from the various democratic institutions and processes that we would include in any definition of a procedural democracy. So we might say a democracy is an arrangement for arriving at decisions where individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote, and where the elected representatives promote the preferences of the public in making decisions on their behalf, and do so fairly and proportionally. In that definition, we have both the election between the elites, but we also have the outcome of the election and the extent to which the representatives actually represent society based on whether they promote the preferences of the public and whether they do so in a way that is accountable to them. Those are clearly outcomes, right? The quality of the representation and the link between governance and public preferences and public opinion, those are outcomes that stand separate from the actual election or institutional process itself. So a substantive definition is going to expect more from democracy than is a procedural definition. Now, understandably then, there's a consensus on procedural definitions. We generally agree that democracy, procedurally understood, is a set of institutions that includes competitive elections, that includes the right to vote for most adults, if not all of them, and so on. In a moment, I'll deal with a more detailed set of characteristics of procedural democracy that helps to illustrate this. But substantive definitions, on the other hand, there's 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 little agreement. Excuse me, I can't talk today. I'm not sure what's going on. There's very little agreement about what constitutes a substantive definition of democracy, because when we debate the products that a democratic regime should generate, there's a lot of disagreement about what we should value and what should matter most. Does the quality of representation matter the most? Does the meaningfulness of elections matter the most? Does accountability, vertical or horizontal, and the extent to which voters can actually punish elected representatives, do these things matter most? There's a lot of disagreement about what substantive outcomes matter the most. So there's a lot of consensus about procedural definitions, but there's no consensus about substantive definitions. So the thin procedural definition is the Schumpeter definition, the one about elections between elites, a race between elites to capture and win the public's vote. But we also have thick procedural definitions that go much further. And Robert Dahl, who wrote that book I just showed you a moment ago, Polyarchy, the book about democracy and opposition, he is most associated with the procedural definition, and especially the thick procedural definition. And his procedural definition begins with 3 requirements. First, citizens must be able to formulate their preferences. That is to say, they must be able to freely form and express preferences. They must be able to express those preferences either individually or collectively through individual participation or collective action. And those preferences must be weighed equally in the conduct of government. These are the 3 overarching requirements that Dahl attaches to a procedural definition of democracy. Now, in a moment, I'll show you the different minimal conditions of democracy that he includes in his definition. And we'll talk about what those are and how those have been expanded upon by subsequent authors. Before we do that, let me take a look at the chat and see what input we have. Oh, no, Christopher, when the people's vote. Yes, so substantive definitions are mainly subjective, right? We're deciding on what we think democracies should do and what kinds of outcomes they should produce. And therefore, there's disagreement about what they should produce, whereas the institutions of democracy are relatively straightforward. So Dahl's view of democracy looks like this. The first minimal condition of 7 is that elected officials make decisions. That is, those officials chosen by the public in competitive races between elites should be the ones who make the decisions that affect everyone in that society or that public. Second, leaders must be chosen in free elections. That is to say that those elections must be competitive, they must be free, as in anyone can run, opposition to the incumbent government can run freely. We would also add that those elections should be frequent. They should happen frequently. All adults can vote or have the right to vote. That is to say that all voting age or eligible adults enjoy the right to participate in elections. All eligible adults can run for office. That is, People of a certain age, depending upon what the rules are, can run for office, can run to participate in government. There's freedom of expression. Individuals can formulate and express preferences freely. There is media freedom in that people can freely communicate their preferences or their views. Media can be private and independent, separate from the government. In authoritarian regimes, the state usually controls most media. Media freedom, therefore, becomes essential. Michael asks, what is considered frequent? Well, good question. I don't know. I think that it probably will depend on the institutional context. So every country has terms and term lengths that are different for elected office. And so I think that those elections should probably take place in line with the term limits and what those stipulate, and how frequently offices should either change hands or be up for grabs in a race, right? So I don't know. I think that doesn't really settle it, but I know the Freedom House does say once a decade, but that doesn't seem very frequently, does it? I think that that's one component that might be more subjective. Citizens should also be able to form free organizations like political parties or civil society groups. They should be able to form these organizations and do so without fear of suppression or violence or coercion. So in China, for instance, not only are political parties other than the Communist Party essentially banned, but religious groups are also forced into the underground if they can exist at all, because it's an atheist state. And so there are all sorts of stories about how civil society has to fly by night in China because of the absence of freedom to form organizations. Now, you may be thinking, this seems far from complete. I can imagine other institutional weaknesses or other limits or missing pieces, right? Other components that aren't here. And in fact, there are a variety of other components that weren't included in Dahl's initial list. And one of those is that the military does not control leaders. And this is especially relevant in the Latin American cases, because in the 90s, especially in Central America, most elected civilian governments basically had to take their cues from the military, who would wield power from behind the scenes by threatening to take over the government if the government didn't make decisions that they wanted. So the military can't control political leaders in a democracy. That's an institutional weakness that certainly should be included. And then the polity similarly should be self-governing, in that institutions and organizations that are vested with the power to make decisions on everyone's behalf should actually be the ones who make those decisions. The president or the legislature shouldn't be unduly influenced by, say, a foreign power like the United States or some other organization or international organization like, say, maybe the IMF, so on and so forth. O'Donnell in 1996 added additional layers that relate to government accountability, and in particular vertical and horizontal accountability, or check and balance relationships between institutions that are designed to minimize or limit arbitrary expressions of power by any single institution, by, say, the president or the courts even. In general, accountability captures the idea that there needs to be some institutional context or some framework for checking the power of any individual institution. There needs to be a set of relationships establish those limits. These are all institutional components, and they imply or suggest a role for a specific kind of institutional framework. As you can see, all of these are laden with the implication that there is a specific set of rules that have to be set up for democracy to function. These aren't just values or norms. These are, in many cases, systems or functions that require a set of rules or a set of institutions. And so finally, on a related note, O'Donnell said that rule of law has to be relevant in part of it too. And rule of law is obviously an informal institution or a value or some sort of less concrete kind of constraint. It's something that's amorphous, right? The rule of law or the authority or the legitimacy or the capacity of the law itself to constrain behavior, either by citizens or by elected leaders. Where it exists because there's this understood or agreed upon value that's placed on the law itself. That is an informal institution. Where it doesn't exist, there's an absence of that value, and we can't say that that informal institution exists in that place. These are all components that imply a need for specific kinds of institutions. And those institutions don't create themselves. We create them. And as I've already explained to you and shown you, before the 18th century, those institutions didn't exist. It was only in the age of revolution when specific places and specific societies began to rise up and demand a sort of negotiation or a settlement with their aristocratic rulers that would result in creating democratic institutions that would capture their preferences and distribute power more widely and involve them in politics and decision making. So these different conditions or components of procedural democracy can't be understood without reference to the institutional foundations that are in place, first and foremost, for these procedural democracies to really exist. But the procedural components are actually only part of the picture. And even though there's agreement about the procedural definition, we still have a lot to learn from those substantive definitions that we might consider or think about. And the substantive definitions have a lot to say too, and they imply a lot with regard to what kinds of institutions would be important as well. But the substantive discussion is important because it gets to differences that we might have in values and what we might think of as important to democracy. Different people have different values and different perspectives about what makes a democracy a democracy. When we move past basic questions about elections, check and balance institutions, et cetera, there are other considerations that might also imply specific kinds of institutions. And so in the first place, we need meaningful elections. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that we need there to be an actual sense that elections are producing outcomes in keeping with the preferences and the desires of the voting public, right? That their vote actually means something, that they're going to the polls not in vain, but to shape and contribute to an outcome and to contribute to self-rule. Only in this case do they trust in democratic institutions. Only in this case do they trust in the rules to work on their behalf. Only in this case do we get that rule of law, or do we get that sort of consensus or that cooperation that we might consider essential to democracy. What else do we want? We want fair representation. That is to say that we want an institutional framework that translates our votes into seats and a distribution of power that is proportional to the actual votes that we cast and the way that we voted. So if more than half of us wanted a certain type of legislature in the hands of, say, a socialist party, well, then more than half of us should get what we want, and the legislature should be in the hands of a socialist party. It shouldn't be the case that different parties have to win a disproportionate amount of the vote to actually get seats in Congress. That wouldn't be an example of fair representation. We want accountability that is vertical and horizontal. That is to say, we want to be able to punish elected officials by voting them out. That is vertical accountability. But we also want there to be accountability between the institutions themselves. We want the courts to check the president. We want the legislature to check the president. We want the president to check the legislature. We want them to have the ability to hold each other accountable and to establish limits on the expression and the exercise of their power. We want there to be relationships of accountability that don't just exist in law, but that exist in practice, that are both de jure and de facto. And then finally, we want there to be a balance of interests. We want there to be majority rule, but also minority rights. We want there to be a way for the majority to govern without impinging on the ability of the minority, that is, the smaller share of the voting public, to actually enjoy their rights and to exist in society and benefit from all of the rights conferred upon them as members of it that everyone else does. Together, these substantive and procedural definitions paint a picture of a very sophisticated type of political system where self-rule is the norm, where rights are shared by all, where institutions exist and check each other and establish clear limits on the expression of power, where institutions and processes translate votes into seats proportionally, where there is meaningful representation and there is trust in institutions and there is the rule of law. All of this creates an urgent need for specific types of institutions. And it also creates the possibility that some democratic institutions might be more democratic than other democratic institutions. For example, if we want fair representation, we might argue that proportional representation electoral systems are more democratic than majoritarian electoral systems. If we care about accountability, we might argue that presidential systems, interestingly, might be more accountable than parliamentary systems, where a single party majority gives the prime minister significant unilateral power. We might argue that if a balance of interests is essential to democracy, that power sharing in deeply divided societies through things like grand coalition governments, proportional representation, quotas, we might argue that these sorts of institutions are useful or necessary to ensure minority rights, but also to create the circumstances for majority rule. These are debates that all fall under the heading of the institutions of democracy. In democracy as a concept and as a system creates or suggests the need for all of these different institutional foundations. And it creates the room for debate and negotiation and discussion about what institutions are more democratic than others and what we want out of a democracy and how we should amend or tailor or maintain the institutions accordingly. And perhaps more than any other type of political system, democracy depends on political institutions to create the foundations for cooperation and accountability and representation and meaningful elections and a balance of interests that helps to promote the interests of the majority, but also those of the minority as well. And so at this moment, I want to actually pause and I want to ask you, what else do we want out of democracy? Is there anything that isn't included in this picture that I've painted about democracy as a concept since the age of revolution? Is there something else that we should be thinking about or that we should keep in mind as we begin to think about the institutions of democracy that will frame our discussion for the rest of the course?
How about something like term limits? So that way, uh, newer people are having newer ideas about an evolving society.
So maybe term limits are a democratic institution. There's a lot of discussion about the value of term limits and what they do and what purpose they serve. In Mexico, for example, notoriously, they historically have had a single term limit for every single elected office. Now, recently, they've begun to change the system a little bit so that legislators can be reelected. But there's a lot of discussion about whether term limits in Mexico have been a benefit to democracy or if they've been harmful to democracy. Now, Christopher seems to suggest that if we think about democracy and we associate it with fresh faces, in new blood, in turnover, in a change in power, maybe term limits become important. I think that's an interesting argument. You could make that argument without a doubt. Are there other institutions that you think we should be keeping in mind or that become relevant when we conceive of democracy in the way that we have so far? Christopher asks, could USPS and its existence remaining important as a federal institution because of mail-in voting taking away from polling institutions? So Christopher's more general question about the independence in the functioning of institutions that relate to the electoral process is a good one. Electoral authorities, electoral commissions need to be independent and need to be functional and not impaired on political grounds. The electoral commission as well as the post office, I think, could be thought of as related and important in that respect. And so, yeah, I totally see that. Giovanni says maybe an age cutoff since there's an age minimum. Touche. There's been some serious discussion lately, especially in the United States, about how age might be a factor and if the generational politics of politics becomes a consideration because, well, there's a huge group of people in this country who simply don't have representation because of how the baby boomers in particular are overrepresented and have a stranglehold on politics. How about progressive ideas such as a term limit on justices? So term limits might be relevant. We talked about that just a moment ago in the case of Mexico, although judges are typically appointed and not elected. And so it's an interesting consideration, I think. Justin says, I think another interesting idea is the discussion of how the idea of unilateral and bicameral legislatures and how that affects democracy is pointed out in the reading with the Westminster model. Yeah, so whether there's two or one legislative houses can sometimes affect policy making. Generally speaking, it's harder to make policy when there are two houses. And so maybe that's a consideration. And maybe there are other factors that would influence whether we would want one or two. Alika says, active participation of citizens in the public and politics as an informal institution. So maybe deliberative democratic procedures like participatory institutions at the local level could be part of that. Giovanni says abolish the electoral college. So maybe more generally, the more general lesson would be direct voting or direct popular voting in elections for elected office. And we know that that is certainly part of the story in our case, but I can imagine that being also relevant in other countries too. Although most countries do have the direct popular vote if they have a presidential system. Kayana says citizens should have better access to certain government information. The government does a lot of censorship. So maybe more transparency and maybe higher transparency standards, access to information. Gustavo says age cutoff is not fair representation though. Touche, Gustavo. I think that that's an interesting and important comment. You can critique these different ideas from different perspectives. But you might argue, though, that if there are demographic imbalances that are distorting representation as it is, that maybe it's justifiable to introduce some sort of a requirement. Make election day a national holiday, access to polls and voting more generally, certainly. Uriel says elected officials needing more qualifications in education or general knowledge about the necessities about the country. Ranked choice voting, says Jake. Ranked choice, says Giovanni. Justin says perhaps expand voting to other territories of the US. So extending the vote more broadly. Okay, so certainly the vote, the franchise. Jeffrey says it's best to not be too democratic. Like, for instance, Supreme Court justices in the Electoral College, a group of professionals who are chosen to make the right and the best decisions for all. Too much democracy is not good at all, but that wouldn't be democracy. That would be aristocracy. Gustavo says, then with that logic, since the majority of people who will vote are white, should there be a cutoff on how many people of a certain race can vote? See, these are the issues that we reckon with. As you can see, there's a lively discussion to be had about what constitutes a democratic institution. And as you can see, there are differences and considerations about what values are democratic and so on. These are disagreements that are healthy and that we'll always have. And this is part of the debate and part of the discourse around democracy. We are done today, and I appreciate your input as always. I'm going to stop the recording. You are free to go, but I will see you on Friday, and I hope that you have a wonderful remainder of your week. I'll see you in office hours if you come by, but have a good one either way.